years ago, we hiked the TCT with a friend. One night, we were nestled in a super cool spot on Death Canyon Shelf, our backs to a sheer face of rock. A raging thunderstorm came through as we were sleeping, and I've never heard such loud sounds reverberating off the cliffs. Terrifying, awe-inspiring. Anyways, I'm a light sleeper, so I was awake a lot of the night. It was pouring ice-cold rain that turned to sleet that blanketed our tent and camp. Around 3:30 in the morning, when I was lying there completely awake, I heard what sounded like a woman's voice. It sounded enough in the distance that it wasn't as if she were in our camp, but close enough that I could clearly catch that she was singing a melody. A completely haunting song that sounded like mourning, like an old folk song in another language. I told my husband and friend the next morning. It sounded like sad yodeling. Ridiculous, I know, but it was very throaty, beautiful, and haunting. Now I wonder, perhaps a native song? It was 3:30 in the morning during a raging thunder and sleet storm. If by some chance some poor soul even happened to be hiking past, they would not have been singing. Pounding sleet, rain, and very close together, peals of thunder and lightning. But we were so far away from the trail that couldn't be. There were no sites occupied near us. Honestly, it stuck with me. I was camping with a friend at a campground just outside Portland. So well traveled, fairly urban, lots of RVs around. It was raining and we were both in my tent dozing off. We heard, I kid you not, a loud animal scream very close by. I'm an ecologist and know all the typical campground animal noises, and this was not something I could identify at all. It sounded like it came from something pretty big, but it wasn't a coyote or a raccoon or anything. My closest guess is maybe a cougar, but I wouldn't expect them so close to people in an urban campground, and the sound was not right. My friend heard it too, and we just waited in silence. A few minutes later, another one screamed back from across the lake. The next morning when we got up, every dog in the campsite was totally terrified. We saw a few that had been leashed outside and were still hiding under RVs. To this day, I maintain it was either Bigfoot or a massive cougar. One night, I was sleeping in my tent, up in the Canadian Shield. I heard crunching on the rocks near to me. It got closer and closer. Then things started brushing against my tent. I was terrified, but also stupidly curious. So I poked my head out of the tent to see what was going on. And guess what I saw? Wolves. A whole pack of wolves, sniffing around the tent. They barely even reacted to me poking my head out, just stared at me and then kept sniffing. I closed the tent back up and hid in my sleeping bag, hoping they didn't decide to rip into my tent and eat me. Took a break along a creek while hiking one time and swore I heard a group of people singing a cool bluesy song off in the distance. I didn't. It was just the creek. Water, rocks, wind, and a bit of rhythm and reoccurring patterns your brain can't make sense of, so it fills up in the gaps and invents explanations for you. We don't call it a babbling brook for nothing. The term is auditory pareidolia, hearing vague music or voices in the distance when there's some background audio stimulus. I was Hiking through an area of desert once at night. It was a fullish moon, so it was pretty bright out, and I see something with a human figure, but it was no human. It was wearing a white gown and a glowing blue and a little bit, but its face was something so terrible I can't even describe. Then, all of a sudden, it just turned into a 3-foot white owl with a very white human-looking face. Come to find out, that owl does not exist, but I have been told it is probably a screen memory, something the brain does to protect you from something horrible. I don't know what I saw out there, but it was terrifying, and it's not even something I can tell people because who in the world would believe that? I probably wouldn't. It's something you have to see to believe. I tend to be skeptical of most things as well, since I think if you want to experience something, you will. However, a few years ago, I was hiking on a lake trail on Upper Saranac. Nothing special, just a late walk for the sunset. We were there hiking and just hanging out in Lake Placid on Saranac. I was alone. The sun had just set, but still bright enough to see. I headed back and I heard some splashing in the lake, like paddling. The trail was probably 30 feet from the edge of the lake. I looked for the canoe or kayak and couldn't see it. The paddling got louder and closer, like a few different boats or some tandem. I still couldn't see what was making the sound, so I walked down to the very edge. As I stood there still, looking at nothing but the lake, the close and clear paddling sounds passed directly by me and faded as they drew further into the lake. I hurried back to the lot after that before it got too dark. I guess it could have been an echo or a sound from something else, but I was right at the edge and I didn't see any boat, person, animal, anywhere close. I was wandering through the pasture and woods on my family's farm, and I have heard some odd things. Weirdest thing, though, was one night my cousins, my sister and I went for a midnight walk, as a wholesome kids tend to do. At the far reach of our land, there is a centuries-old family cemetery. Most of the gravestones have been worn down by time, but the newest grave we can make out dates back to 1865. It sits on a hill in the middle of a pasture, marked from a distance by a single old-growth oak tree. You can see it from a distance. It was about 1:30 a.m., and one of my cousins gasps. We ask what right as we all see what she saw. There was what looked to be a kerosene lantern lit and moving around in the cemetery. No one lives for miles in this direction. We're about a quarter mile away when we stopped. We watched it for a couple of minutes and decided it was time to go when it suddenly and finally went out. Was camping alone at a nearby lake in my late teens. I'd basically bushwhacked to a remote part of the woods just off the shoreline of the lake. I grew up hiking and camping whenever I could get to it, so I was used to the noises and calls animals will make in the woods at night. Sometime after I fell asleep, long enough for the small fire to die to embers, I woke up with this immediate awareness that I was not alone. I couldn't hear much over the bug noise of summer, but then I heard voices off behind me. I slowly threw as much dirt and rock onto what was left of the fire and waited. It sounded like someone whispering or talking low. I strained my ears, but the harder I listened, the more everything began to meld together. At one point, it sounded like they were to my left, then minutes later, directly to my right. and once it sounded like the voices were tuning in and out like radio, kinda quiet, then suddenly louder. I laid there, motionless, for hours. I fell asleep for a few hours after the sun was starting to come up. When I awoke again, I packed up, crept back out of those woods. It just did not feel right. Haven't felt it since, thankfully. I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long-abandoned town in the surrounding area. To get to as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over a creek 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye just ahead of me. There was a man in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pajamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off all the alarms in my head nevertheless. He also wasn't wearing any shoes and looked well groomed and were cleaned. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, nothing. He was just gone. Still rubs me the wrong way. The area I was in, a pretty rough hike, very secluded. Not very many people venture as deep as I was that day. No idea what was going on there.